they're in different train cars. And then as, like, the story goes on in the next page or two, they talk about how they're, like, next to each other, and they're talking. And they're, like, in a situation together, so then they're not in separate cars, and then they say they're, like, in a taxi.
They take the train into the city, and they all travel in separate cars. Like, Tom and Nick can travel together because it's not weird for them to be hanging out, but they can't travel with Myrtle because people would be like, what are they doing together? What's going on? Right? Then they get in a taxi.
Okay, so I just have a hard time picturing what they're actually doing.
Sometimes books jump a little bit from section to section, and the best way to catch that is like if you're reading along and all of a sudden you're like, I don't know what's going on. Sort of backtrack and look for the gaps. Sometimes gaps are indicated because they'll double space paragraphs and you'll get like a bigger space between two paragraphs. Other times they'll put like a little emblem right there, like a star or an asterisk or, you know, like an ampersand or something. So.
It's weird. Simple.
Ampersand. So who's got another question? Yeah.
So when Nick is talking to Tom and Daisy, they're like asking about his like engagement, but he's like, it's not like really a thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then at the end of chapter 3, when he's talking about like how he like wants to pursue Jordan, but he's been like writing letters, it's like a girl and like signing them like love Nick. Is that the same girl that he wants to break off with?
Yeah. Questions? Yeah. Yeah.
Does Tom's wife know about this?
We don't know yet. At this point, we don't know if Daisy knows. We know that Daisy's, she's not happy. She's known about other women, but we don't know that she knows about Myrtle.
I know there was someone when he got the call.
Mm-hmm.
That
was Jordan. Jordan's talking to Nick at that point, saying she's got a woman in New York. But even then, you can ask yourself, wait a minute, Myrtle's not in New York. So is that someone else, or are they just talking about the fact that they think the woman's in New York because he keeps that apartment? Yeah.
Another thing I was like slightly confused about is, it's kind of related to him. Myrtle like knows about Daisy and she knows she's the other woman.
Mm-hmm.
So like, why was Tom so mad that she was talking about her and broke her nose?
I think it has a lot to do with the fact that it's like mistresses and the women you're married to, there's a separation there. Like you can do things with your mistresses that you can't do with your wives. There's an episode of The Sopranos that talks about this, but that's the kicker. Myrtle's a mistress. Like she's automatically lower in rank than Daisy because Daisy's the wife. And so therefore Myrtle has no business speaking ill of Daisy. And that's why he hit her in the face. Yeah.
I really don't understand why Nick is just okay with, like, going into town and having a party with Tom and his mistress. Because that just, like, seemed really awkward, but he seems really okay with that.
It is awkward, and he talks about the fact that he's never really been a big drinker, but this is what people do. I mean, it's like, this is what people do at this time. Like, people are running around like lunatics, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. You know, but I mean, it's just like, no, it's like, as a culture, like, people are just like, woo, we're gonna do whatever we want. And he just goes with it. He's like, okay. You know, he might be sitting there reserving his own judgment, but he still gets drunk, you know, and he still rolls with the party. So, you know, yeah.
It's kind of off topic, but, in the new, Great Gatsby,
Yeah.
who played Tom McCann?
Tom McCann, I have no
The
idea.
guy, it was Leonardo DiCaprio, and then...
I don't know
the guy
who
played
that actor is. Like, I'll look it up and figure it out for you, but I don't know who he is.
I have it. I
So-
had it earlier. I looked it up.
Any more questions? Confusion? Okay, what do you find interesting? Yeah,
I
Nick.
found it interesting that Tom just punched Myrtle in the face.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's another thing that it's one of the, like, first of all, you get all these hints about Tom, like they talk about his physicality and how he's a physical person and how he's always like pushing Nick to do stuff, like he grabs him by the arm and pulls him in and he pushes him out, you know, and then Daisy talks about how he's a big brute of a man, you know, like he's even too physical with Daisy. They sort of imply that he hurts her sometimes, but it's the time period. Men hit women. It might not have been something that, you know, was accepted, but people did it. It was just sort of the nature of the beast. Yeah.
Kind of related to hit, I thought that was interesting about how they didn't just talk about what happened. He
Mhm.
made it seem like it was in like a drunken stupor, and he's not really sure what happened. It kind of blurred, and he's explaining the little details. They saw blood here and blood there,
Mhm.
and then just kind of stops.
Yeah, well, you have to understand that by the time he hits her in the face, people are trashed at this party, and so he doesn't really remember it. And Nick says, it's like the first time he's been drinking, like seriously drinking, and so it just comes back to him in blurs. He remembers the blood, he remembers the screaming, but he doesn't actually remember what exactly happened. He just knows that there was a fight. So, yeah.
It was Joel Edgerton. That's the guy.
That's who it was.
Yeah.
Thank
Well,
you.
I had no idea who
Thank
that
you.
is.
He was in a lot of really like indie movies, like small ones.
Oh, okay.
So
Bates
small
films.
actors.
Cool. So, anybody else find anything interesting?
Owl Eyes.
What, the guy in the library?
Yeah.
Yeah.
He, like, everyone else at the party was kind of just hanging around doing their own thing.
Mm-hmm.
And he was, like, finding out about casting. It was interesting.
He's rooting around,
Yeah.
The
right?
older guy.
Yeah. There's an interesting thing in that particular scene. Do you have the page on that one?
Yeah, page 45.
Okay. Open your books to page 45. Okay, it's on page 40, and the bottom of page 45, I'll say. So, at the bottom of page 45, the old ally says, "See," he cried triumphantly, "it's a bona fide piece of printed matter. It fooled me. This fellow's a regular Velasco. It's a triumph. What thoroughness, what realism. Knew when to stop, too. Didn't cut the pages." Does anybody know what that means, didn't cut the pages?
What's the sentence?
Where the whole thing.
But how do you know?
Because he didn't have to
What do you mean, though? What does cutting the pages mean?
like turn it more than one, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Oh.
Yeah. The way old books were printed was they were printed on like single sheets of paper and then they were folded along the edges. So they would print front to back and then fold it and bind it. So all the pages had creases along the sides, and in order to read them you had to cut them open. And that's what he's talking about. He said, didn't even cut the pages. Gatsby has an entire library full of books he's never read. And that's what Old Allies is figuring out in there. Because one of the things, the reality of it is that house, these parties, everything is for show. It's all a facade. It's something he's creating and making to figure out why things go on farther. Yeah.
That's something that I was confused about that I wrote. Was like, I've seen the movie, so I know why, but as I was reading, they didn't really cover why he was throwing the parties or anything like that yet.
Yeah, they haven't touched it yet.
Okay, I was a little lost.
So anything else anybody find interesting?
Yeah, I just thought it was interesting. His whole thing, just like throwing these giant parties with like, and people just come and they don't know him, but like they just kind of like get to the circle and then they keep on going, but like he just stands there and doesn't really have interest in talking to those people.
Right, he's not even engaging with his guests. And in fact, they're not really guests at all. They just show up. Because Nick talks about the fact he's the only person who's ever received an actual invitation. Everybody else just jumps in their cars and drives in from the city to go to these parties because they know that they're going to be there.
I didn't find the page, but it's somewhere after, but before he gets to the garage or whatever, he like really emphasizes how everything is gray and ashy. He said like literally ashy, like everything's covered in ash, but like why?
Yeah. I had to look this one up too because it totally threw me. And what it is you've got New York, and surrounding New York as you drive out to the country is this band of trash and ash. And the ash is left over from burning coal, because the majority of people use coal to keep their homes. But when you burn coal, just like when you burn fire, there's ash left over. So they scoop it up and they take it out to this area beyond the city. And basically it's just a big open trash dump. And that's what they drive through on their way to the city, the Valley of Ashes. And that's where the garage is. Yeah, the garage is situated in. Because there's really no such thing as landfills at this point. Like, there's no such thing as, like, we have to deal with our trash. They're just dumping it outside of the city because, people who live in the city can't see it because it's far enough out. But if you're out in the country where they all live, you have to drive through to get into the city. Yeah, and you'll get a better visualization of that, like, when we watch the movie. Any more questions? Okay. So, what we're going to do is take out a blank sheet of paper, and we're going to take some notes on the time period itself. So, The Great Gatsby is a fantastic book for a lot of reasons, and one of the reasons is the fact that it really showcases this entire sort of 9-year period post-World War I, before the Great Depression, when, you know, all people were doing was partying. Never works for So one of the things I want to highlight is the women's fashion, because they talk about that a lot in the books. And this is what women looked like before the 1920s. And take a look at it. You'll notice that the skirts aren't necessarily on the ground as they were like in the Edwardian and the Victorian periods, but the dresses are still relatively long. They might be a little bit shorter, like for like a sporting attire or something like that, but as a whole, you know, it's still very, very covered, long skirts, you know, so on and so forth. And they talk about it a lot in the books. They talk about women, they talk about women's fashion, and it's important to pay attention to. So, women were still wearing corsets at this time. And this is a good sort of illustration of how the corsets displace all the internal organs and sort of squish everything up. When you read older books, you notice that women are constantly fainting, or, you know, it's like, oh, you know, they can't get too excited and stuff like that. It's because they can't breathe. Because literally you can't deep breathe at all because you've got yourself cinched in so completely. And so, here's some pictures. And one of the things is, like, the corset itself relaxed as people moved beyond the Victorians. The Victorians are 1800 to 1840, roughly. And then 1850 to 1900 are the Edwardians. And they're named that way for the kings and queens of England. The Victorians were very, very cinched up. Like, they went to that, like, 17-inch waist. Like, super, super tiny. And as they moved forward, you know, the corset itself relaxed. So over there on the right, that would be a more adequate representation of women sort of in the 1910s, 1915, before the 1920s. And this would be a representation of a Victorian. This is what a Victorian woman would have looked like super cinched up, super tiny. And with corsets, you can't do anything. Like, you can't bend over, you can't engage in physical labor. So this particular fashion trend that, you know, went on for roughly, you know, over 100 years, give or take. And, you know, and women in the 1700s as well were pretty cinched up. Seriously limited a woman's physical activity. It limited what they could do. It's like you were sort of relegated to sitting on couches and just looking pretty. And a lot of women's fashion trends have always been this way. Like, you look at the 1700s and the 1600s, and women wore huge dresses and big hats. You can't really do anything in that except stand around or sit and just look pretty, and that's it. And for hundreds of years, that's what women did. They just stood around or sat and just looked beautiful because they were seriously restricted by the fashion dictates. So the big change in the 1920s is that all of a sudden women weren't wearing corsets anymore. They said, forget it, we're not going to do it anymore. And it's a simple, you know, article of clothing, but it all of a sudden opened up all these avenues physically for women. You know, they could get jobs, they could go out, they could run around, they could play sports, and that's why when you get Jordan Baker, you know, she plays golf. Like, it's a big deal. Like, she, you know, she's a very, very flat character, but she serves a purpose. Like, she is our, you know, idealized 1920s woman. She's free. She runs around the country. You know, she plays sports. You know, she's very attractive. She's very fashionable. That's her purpose in the novel. But you'll notice here, like, there's no distinctive waist. Women started wearing dresses that were very, very straight, and you'll also know that they're substantially shorter. They fell below the knee. You know, that made people crazy. So, in the before the 1920s, women still had really long hair. And I know it's easy to be like, long hair, whatever, like, who cares? Women still have long hair. I'm talking really long hair, like down to their waists or beyond. That's a huge limiting factor as well. Like, Victorian women had big hair. They wore hair pieces. It was ginormous. And it slowly got less and less and less. But even up until this time, women still had to have long hair. It was considered their sort of crowning glory, if you will. It was it was the thing that made you very beautiful. If you wanted to have beautiful long hair. And women did not wear their hair down in public after a certain age. It was expected that the only people that would see you with your hair down, your husband or your close family members. That was it. So all women had very long hair, and they all, wore it sort of piled up on their heads. And then in the 1920s, all of a sudden, everybody's hair is super short, and they talk about it in the book. They talk about the bobs. Women cut off all their hair, and it was huge and scandalous because, it was a valued commodity to have beautiful long hair, to have lots of it piled up on your head. And then all of a sudden women were saying, no, I don't want that anymore, I'm taking it off. And there was no such thing as beauty parlors. Women went to barbers, like men's places to get their hair cut, and they went at it with a straight razor. The same thing that they just hacked it straight off. And there's all different kinds of bobs. You could have straight hair bobs, and then in the middle you get the finger waves that are more popular. So, and there's some other things. There was the smoking and the drinking. Like, up until this point, it was very taboo for women to drink socially. Like, yeah, you might have a little glass of wine with dinner, but otherwise you didn't go out and party. You didn't go out dancing and drinking. You just didn't do it. Smoking, women didn't smoke up until the 1920s. It was something that was reserved solely for men. And women took it on in the 1920s as sort of symbol of their own individualism and their freedom, which is an advertising campaign that continued well on into the 60s and 70s. Women had a lot more freedom. They dated, they didn't get married, they had the possibility of careers, and some of them even went to college. Up until this point, sort of pre-1920s, it was fully expected that as a woman, you would stay at home until some nice man showed up to marry you. He would court you according to your family's rules, otherwise known as sitting on the porch and talking to you while your mom was sitting in the corner chaperoning your conversation. You would meet half a dozen times and then decide to get married. And that's just what you did. And as a woman, your role was simply to keep house for that man and make babies. That was your life. That was the arc of your existence. It didn't matter if you went to college. You were to take care of your husband, keep his house. It's not her house, it's his house. Because, in the book, you'll notice that they talk about going over to the Tom Buchanan's. Right? It's not Daisy and Tom's house, it's Tom Buchanan's house. Like, Daisy still has no right to that property. And also cars. Cars were a big deal during this time because, one, they gave women freedom on the road because women could drive. They could learn how to drive, and now they could, go places of their choosing. But also cars became this sort of big scandalous thing because you've got, all the young people making out and possibly having sex in cars. Because it's like your own private little place. You can go and drive off in the woods if you've got your own little space, and it was really scandalous. So, and the reason this happened is that after World War I, and World War I was this huge moment of awakening, and we talked about it a little bit last year, the fact that people went into World War I fully believing that they would win it in a couple of weeks, that it would just be over. And then it just went on and on and on. Jackson, you listening to music? You want to put those down for me so that I don't forget? Are you taking notes on your computer or are you watching videos?
I'm taking notes.
Okay, close the computer. Thank you. So, what ends up happening is that all the men died. Like, it's an entire generation of men that are just gone. Up until this point, women were sitting at home waiting for their husbands, waiting for their men, and then they didn't come home. They all died. And so they're faced with a problem. All of a sudden, there's not enough men for husbands. And so the women, they're just like, why am I waiting at home for a man who's never going to come? I'm going to go out and do something with my life. It also inspired this idea that life is short, because after World War I, everybody dies. So all of a sudden, everyone's thinking, wait a minute, it's like everything is so fleeting. Why am I sitting here doing nothing? And also, post-World War I, when everybody was returning, there was the Spanish flu epidemic that killed even more people. So it was another reminder of the fact that life is really, really short. So women decided, I'm going to go out and I'm going to do something with my life. I'm going to take advantage of what I have. I'm going to go out, I'm going to cut my hair. I'm going to wear clothes that I can move in. I'm going to go out and do things. I'm not just going to sit at home and be an old maid because my fiance, my suitor died. And they talk about this a little bit in The Great Gatsby, because Daisy is sitting at home waiting for Gatsby to come back. And they'll get into it in the future chapters. And it's like she has that moment where she's like, why am I waiting? Why am I sitting around waiting for this man? I may need a minute. So this goes on until September 20th, 1929. The partying and the freedom and the running around and the general debauchery. People are just drinking like crazy things and just party, party, party. Life's a party. It's all about, experiences and doing things and having a good time. And one of the things that they touch on in The Great Gatsby, but he doesn't really tell you directly so you can pull it out, it's just that people with money, party, party, party. But people who didn't have money, it's like no one cared. And this is something that comes up after the stock market crashes. And all of a sudden, you've got all these people out of work, it's the Great Depression, and there's no social programs to take care of them. And I know social programs, social welfare, these things become, they're hot topics in terms of, national news and things like that. But you have to ask yourself, if we don't have, unemployment, if we don't have food stamp programs, what's the alternative? People starve to death and die. And that's what was happening after the stock market crash. So this is a nifty graph that shows the unemployment rate in the United States. And you'll notice that it was sort of rolling at sort of the tail end of 1930, rolling at about 5%. Like even now we don't have an unemployment rate of 5%, we're closer to 8%. And then it rolls up to, 22%. And that's the stock market. Everything, banks went out of business, everything went out of business. People lost everything, and everybody was out of work. I've given you some pictures here. Kids out on a picket line, why can't you find my dad a job? American poverty, 1920s. And then up in the right-hand corner, you've got soup lines. That's one of the things that the government started doing when they realized there was a serious problem, was they started feeding people. And there was no such thing as food banks at this point. So they set up soup lines, bread lines, and people would just line up. And, and they would serve as many people as they could, and then that was that. Does anyone have any questions?